Right, well, time to talk to the Shadow Defence Minister, Brendan O'Connor. First, here was Labor's Jason Clare on what should be done right now to help vulnerable Australians stranded in India.
I think it'd be a big call, though, to make it a crime for Australians trying to get home. I think what we should be doing is trying to make it easier for people to get home. So when we did something like this in respect of flights from China, we chartered a flight to Wuhan to get Aussies out and took them to Christmas Island. Why aren't we doing that now?
Brendan O'Connor, thanks for your time this morning. Can you just clarify, for starters, what is Labor's position here? Should Australians who are stuck in India, those in vulnerable situations particularly, should they be collected and flown back to Christmas Island?
I think there should be a great deal of focus on exactly how we'll return Australians to this country. Unfortunately, the government has chosen not to do the things that matter at an appropriate time, including, for example, ensuring that we have facilities for quarantining Australians returning home. So if the government had focused properly upon the quarantine facilities, as recommended by its own review, as recommended by state premiers, we would not be in this position, David, of having to restrain Australians from returning home.
Take your point on all of that, but just to clarify, what should happen right now? Should we use charter flights to get some of those vulnerable Australians back here?
I think every avenue should be explored to ensure that we look after Australian citizens overseas.
Including that one?
Absolutely. The government made commitments that it would return Australians before Christmas. The government's abrogated its responsibility with respect to its role in terms of quarantine. In fact, the Constitution makes clear that the Commonwealth is responsible for quarantining and in fact has left the state governments to lead on this issue. The lockdowns that we've seen, multiple lockdowns we've seen across the country because of the deficiencies in the quarantine system is in part because of the federal government's failure to build purpose-built facilities, as should have happened last year.
And what about this measure they've announced, a threat of jail and big fines for anyone who does find a way back to Australia? What does Labor think about that?
Well, frankly, the focus should be returning Australians home. I have to say I'm surprised that the government is looking to go down that path. I believe that the sort of ban on flights would be sufficient to prevent people coming back to Australia. So I think in part that's a political distraction from the main focus, which should be finding whatever means possible to ensure that Australians are able to return home. I mean, India, it's a tragedy what's happening in India. It's an international crisis and we need to do more to assist that country. Indeed, all countries need to assist India at this point in time. But I don't believe the government should be focusing on how to criminalise or jail Australians for wanting to return home.
So they shouldn't do this.
Focused on how they can find a better way to ensure that they return home.
Appreciate
and that's
that
not happening to date.
Just want to be clear on this, though. You're opposed to this biosecurity measure threatening jail.
Well, I think the government can invoke those powers and the health minister's decided to do so, but I think it's a distraction, frankly. I think that, and I think it's important to note that if the government had taken the advice of the Holton Review and the advice of premiers to build purpose-built facilities, well, I think that's important to note.
Yeah, I'm just wanting to be clear here. You're saying they should not have done this biosecurity power?
I think in practical terms, it's not relevant insofar as flight bans will prevent Australians returning home anyway. So I think to a large extent that is a deliberate political strategy to distract from their failure to build quarantine facilities that would have enabled Australians returning home more effectively.
The government, just changing tack, the government's today making a big pre-budget announcement on childcare, $1.7 billion in extra support, targeting those who have more than one child in care. Not as generous as Labor's plan for those earning higher incomes, family incomes of $400,000 or $500,000 a year. Nonetheless, is the government stealing your thunder?
Well, it's too little. It won't be sufficient to provide the support needed. Childcare costs are going through the roof. They're not affordable for families, and this will not assist in improving employment participation for women in particular. So it doesn't in any way steal the thunder of Labor. It actually fails dismally to respond to a social and economic need in this country, and that is to make sure that childcare is affordable for families. That this does not pass that test.
But it is more generous than Labor's, at least for those on lower incomes with multiple kids in childcare.
It excludes 3/4 of the families that would be able to be accessing the support if Labor were elected and were able to implement that policy. So it's a big difference between what we were announcing and what we were suggesting, what they've announced.
Let's turn to the regional security situation. What have you made of China's increased military exercises and incursions into Taiwan's airspace?
Well, there's no doubt that China has become more forceful in the way it behaves in the region. There's no doubt about that in recent times. And of course, we need to make sure that we play a role in the region to maintain peace and stability. That's critical. Therefore, we should be conscious of what's happening, be aware of what's happening, ensure through diplomatic means we maintain the stability and the peace in the region. That's something that needs to be, that is critical. But I think it's also important that when we talk about these issues, David, we do so in a sober and cautious way, and we don't create anxiety unnecessarily, which I think we've seen on display in the last week.
We have seen Taiwan's foreign minister, though, say that China has been conducting hybrid warfare and seems to be, quote, preparing for their final military assault against Taiwan. Do you agree?
No, that's not the advice that's been provided to the Australian government, or indeed advice that's been provided to the federal opposition. Of course, we have to be concerned about what's happening in our region, but that's certainly not the advice that's been provided to me in briefings.
You mentioned some of the language we've seen in the last week or so. In his Anzac Day memo to staff, Mike Pezzullo, the Home Affairs Secretary, said, and I quote, "As free nations again hear the beating drums and watch worryingly the militarisation of issues that we had until recent years thought unlikely to be catalysts for war, let us continue to search unceasingly for the chance for peace." Did you have a problem with these comments from Mike Pezzullo?
Well, I don't think they were particularly helpful, David. Those types of comments are not going to assist, I believe. But what's more concerning, I think, is the fact that it was, firstly, if indeed there is a need to say such things, because there's been some material change since the Defence Strategic Update of last year, then they should have been said by a minister. If they're not to be said by a minister, then what was the point of them, and why are they inconsistent with the comments made by the Minister for Defence on your program, on this program last Sunday? So I don't think they were necessary. I don't think they assisted in any way, and nor too do I think that the fact that the Prime Minister chose to re-announce an announcement of 2 years ago in Northern Territory very helpful in the way in which it just seemed to be using defence and defence announcements to distract from the failure of government to deal with the pandemic and to deal with quarantine. That seemed to be the reason for the decisions made by government to re-announce the Northern Territory facility training that occurred this week. So I think in combination, there seems to be a lack of discipline and coherence by the government in relation to defence. And the real focus should be on implementing the defence asset contracts, which have become a major problem for the government. Major blowouts on the future submarines program.
I'll come to that. Just quickly, though, on Mike Pezzullo, do you have any problem if he were to be made Defence Secretary? Would you be opposed to that?
No, look, Mike Pezzullo is a competent public servant, and I worked with him in government. That's up to the government what they do. I think it's probably... although I have to say, having a new Home Affairs Minister and a new Home Affairs Secretary probably wouldn't be the best decision made, but that's entirely up to the government. OK, well,
let's talk about defence spending. Does Australia need to increase its defence spending?
Well, I think it's fair to say the first thing we need to do is to make sure we fulfil the contracts that we have to build submarines and frigates and other defence assets. The problem we have at the moment, David, is we have major blowouts in timelines and costs in relation to the biggest defence asset contracts we've had in our history. And the government can talk rhetorically about defence all it likes, but unless it ensures that the future submarine program is on track, that the frigates are also on track and other defence assets, we're going to have real issues in terms of filling defence capability going forward. That should be the focus of the government right now. And what's happened instead, we've seen major blowouts, $40 billion blowout in the future submarine program, a delay of up to 10 years in terms of getting new submarines in the water. There's been no announcement about whether the Collins-class submarines will be upgraded, and if so, when are they going to have their life extended?
What do you think the government should do here, Brendan O'Connor? Should they stick with the Naval contract for the French design and built submarines, or should they walk away from it?
Well, they'll know better than we do, because they're privy to information that's not always provided to the opposition or to the public. But the real problem here has been a failure to fulfil the commitments made when the contract was signed. Of course, they'll have to consider what they do here, but at the very least, we need to have a decision made in relation to the life extension of the Collins-class submarines. We've yet to hear what the government will do there. We've yet to hear whether they're going to maintain the full cycle docking of Collins-class submarines in Adelaide or Western Australia, even though we were told that would be we'd be advised of that by the end of 2019. There are a whole range of issues and decisions that need to be made. Decisions that need to be made by the government have yet to be made. So we'd be better placed if the government came clean and explained exactly where we were with respect to the future submarine program, the frigates and other defence asset contracts.
All right. Given what you've said, though, about the need to get these programs back on track, as a quantum, though, just coming back to this question about defence spending, it's now over 2% of GDP. Is that enough? Does it need to be more?
Well, Labor supports the minimum of 2% and have done so ever since the 2013 White Paper. Every Labor leader since has committed to that minima. If there needs to be an increase in defence spending, it will depend on the circumstances, and that's why, for example, the government needs to brief the opposition as to whether there's been any change to the situation since the 2020 Defence Strategic Update. If there's been material change to the circumstances in the region, then there may well be a need to increase defence spending, but that's the sort of advice that the opposition would need to be briefed on by the government. But to date, I would say the main thing to do is to fulfil the commitments made when entering into those contracts for those major defence assets. That's the priority, and Peter Dutton needs to focus on that more than anything else.
Shadow Defence Minister Brendan O'Connor, thank you.
Thanks very much, David.